Thank you.
Good. One of the things he missed about my bio is that when I was really little, I wanted to be a Jedi. And so for a guy who goes around and delivers a lot of PowerPoint presentations, this clicker is about as close as I get to the lightsaber. So if I had some sound effects, that might improve things. But in any event, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I'm particularly excited about it because of the nature of this audience. It's a funny thing. Usually when you go out and give a talk about education, it's either a K-12 audience, or it's a conference that just has higher ed administrators. And it's kind of funny because there's actually very few forums around the country, especially national conferences, where those two groups ever interact or mingle in the same event. And then, you know, I'll do a couple talks with like chambers of commerce, right? So a lot of business leaders. But it's actually really rare that there's an audience like this where we have a mix of legislators, business leaders, K-12 leaders, higher education leaders. And I would submit to you that this is exactly the kind of gathering and conversation that the whole country needs to have. So first of all, kudos to the Albertson Foundation for your focus on this, for inviting me here today. It's also a special moment for me because I'm checking off one of my bucket list items. I have now visited all 50 states in the United States. And so I thought that was a really great piece of news to share, but someone over dinner last night goes, well, why was Idaho last? And I just said, because no one invited me until now. So thank you to the Albertson Foundation for the invitation to be here. Look, I'd like you for a minute to imagine America as a talent development machine. Just think about that concept for a minute, a talent development machine that theoretically starts at birth and carries through until the very end. And if we think about it in that big, grand scheme, it's a pretty powerful vision of what we could become as a country. And I would submit to you that we're doing a pretty poor job of serving as a talent development machine. So I'll talk about this. The title of my presentation is Building the Educonomy. And I wish it weren't a made-up word, but it is. Just a fake word that kind of sounds good, right? Because it's a lot about how I think we need to strengthen connections between our education system writ large. I'm not just talking about K-12 here, but higher education and all the different facets of it, and how that connects to the broader workplace across the country. Now, this isn't just about businesses. Some people kind of take this in the wrong way. When we talk about education and jobs, they just think about for-profit businesses. I'm talking about all employers of all shapes and sizes, all types around the country. And so I'm going to share with you a lot of information Gallup has across research we've done across K-12, across higher education, into the workplace, and even at a global level. So some of you may be familiar with the notion that Gallup runs a daily poll. We interview a representative sample of Americans every night across the year, 350 days of the year, so there's a couple weeks that we take off. But we also run the World Poll, which statistically samples 98% of the adult population on the planet every year. So the insights I have to share literally run the gamut from what we know about fifth graders all the way across what we know about how people rate and experience their lives across the world. And there's some fascinating common threads that I want to pull through all of this. So here's the first thing that I would suggest is happening in the United States, is that when we think about schools in the U.S., we have a pretty negative attitude about schools. We've actually been tracking Americans' confidence in public schools since the early 70s, and basically it's been going down. Now, it could be a lot worse. You could be Congress. Our confidence in Congress is at like -2. So schools relative to Congress ought to feel really good. But here's the point. We've become very negative about how we view schools. And so if you read news stories, with the exception of very well-run organizations that focus exclusively on education news and know what they're talking about, most of the headlines are kind of negative, right? And we think about this through a deficit-based lens. So we're all worked up on how ineffective teachers are, what students don't know, right? We come at it through this lens of what's wrong. And we even do it as parents. So I'm a parent of a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and there's all these apps now for parents. So if you're a recent parent, you know what I'm talking about. In these apps, basically, every day it's like, here's what your baby or your infant or your toddler should be doing. Here's the milestone they should be hitting. But most of this is a focus on warning signs, right? Like, oh, if if this is happening, it might be a sign of this or that or this, and so it creates this hypochondriac parent scenario. But here's the point. Most of these tools for parents are about helping you identify problems with your child. And if there's anything Gallup has learned about human development, and this is human development across the globe, and it doesn't matter how old or young you are, it doesn't matter race, it doesn't matter culture. If there's anything we've learned about human development, it's a very simple thing. People who've become very successful figured out early on what they were really good at, and they turned that into excellence. It's a strengths-based lens, not a deficit-based lens. So think about the craziness in education, because I would submit to you, even the words we use take us down the wrong path, okay? So the movement now that we've talked about at a national level, a lot of the world's leading experts in education, they call themselves education reformers. And we have a movement in the United States called an education reform movement. Now, I'm going to do a quick Gallup poll. I'd like you to raise your hand high if you are interested in being reformed. Can you, just a quick, hold your hand up if you would like to be reformed. Okay. Look, here's the simple but very powerful point about this. I could come up with a lot of very exciting words. Reform is not one of them. Reform just sounds ugly to me, right? It's re-engage, re-inspire, reimagine. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we could think of, but not reform, yet that's what we've named this movement that we hope improves schools and educational performance in this country. Guess what? We do this with courses for students who are behind. What do we call them? Remedial courses. And the students who are in them know that. These are not students who need remediation, they need acceleration. The words we use are so powerful because it sets up the framework for how we think about this. We're also focused on, I would argue, a very narrow set of metrics that we use to define success for students and teachers and schools and superintendents and everybody else. Now, I'm not suggesting we get rid of these things, but just think about how narrow they are. They are necessary but insufficient measures. So we have things like how they do on test scores, some form of graduation or retention rates, right, depending on the terminology you use. Grade point average. These are all helpful tools, but right now the mistake I think we're making is that we look at those things as ultimate outcomes. We look at it as if a kid graduates and gets a diploma, that's a home run. Now that's a flag, an important flag that I want to see them knock over on the way to a greater outcome. But let me ask you a simple question. If you graduate from college and you don't get a good job, is that the outcome we were all hoping for? What if you don't get any job? I've got a diploma and no job. Is that a home run? No. You count as a win in every educational statistic we have, but it's not exactly the win that we were looking for, right? There's something beyond that. So these things are what I would argue necessary but insufficient measures. They are flags that we should be paying attention to that need to be knocked over on the way to a more ultimate goal. If we treat these kinds of measures as the ultimate outcome of education, we're leaving all of us really short. So here's what Gallup knows about student engagement. We offer what's called our Gallup Student Poll. It measures hope, engagement, and well-being in 5th through 12th graders. And what we've learned about student engagement is that it goes down every single year. You'd think the longer students are in school, the more engaged they'd be. It's actually the opposite. The longer they're in school, the less engaged they are, and it goes down literally every single year, right? So about 76% of elementary students are engaged, 61% of middle school students, 44% of high school students. If I showed you this chart by every year, every grade level, it goes down every single year. The only year where there's a plateau in the decline is between 10th and 11th grade. And that's just simply because that's the year when most students drop out. So if we were doing this well, this is national data, right? So there are high schools all over our country that are on the opposite end of this scale. High schools whose student engagement levels are higher than most of the elementary schools we measure. So the good news is there are schools all over that are on a totally different plane. The problem is it hasn't been brought to scale because at a national level, if we were doing this well, this data ought to be going in the opposite direction. If not, you could argue at least being maintained over time. By the way, we just reported this an hour ago on Gallup.com. You'll see it on the news and on Bloomberg News shortly. But we also asked them about their confidence in getting a good job when they graduate. And their confidence in that goes down every single year, just like this student engagement data. So you think about it. If our K-12 system is about two primary goals, helping our kids become college and or career ready, And of course, college ready just means eventually career ready, right? Just a different type of career sort. Well, how is it possible that the closer they get to graduation, the less confident they feel about getting a good job? And oh, by the way, we also reported today that girls lose their confidence more than boys. So we still have an awful lot of work to do, even though we've made gains as a country in the percentage of women going to college, women in the workplace. There's still an issue as it relates to girls in our schools today and their confidence in getting a good job when they graduate. So here's a good one for you about the, back to this talent development machine vision, right? If we were doing this right, it ought to be a seamless ecosystem between our schools, our universities, and our employers. And right now, the visual is probably more of castles with large moats in between them. Now, everybody can come up with an example of a high school that collaborates with a university, you know, an employer that has a great relationship with a school. Everybody's got their one example. But at a national level, we couldn't have a bigger gulf between these things. So we got lucky this year. These are 3 different studies Gallup did with 3 different populations where we asked essentially the same question. The first was a survey of provosts, the chief academic officers of colleges and universities. And we said, hey, how well do you think you're doing preparing students for success in the workplace? 96% are somewhat or extremely confident that they're doing a good job. By the way, this was last year's data. We just finished the new version of this year. Pathetically, it's gone up. It's now 98% of provosts. You see where I'm going with this? Because when we ask the American population, representative sample of Americans, do you think college graduates are well prepared for success in the workplace? They have a little different scorecard than the provosts do. 14% last year strongly agreed that college graduates are ready, and this year it's dropped to 12.6. So even though I spent the last year sharing this data with the country, it obviously has made no dent because the gulf is widening. When we ask a representative sample of chief-level, C-level titled business leaders, it's even worse. 11% strongly agree that college graduates have the skills needed to fill the jobs they're looking for. So this is not a skills gap. This is more of a gulf in understanding. I'd suggest you to dig carefully into a couple things. So just one example. We all agree that critical thinking is important for students to experience in school, right? To be taught critical thinking skills. Business leaders and school leaders all agree on that point. But here's the thing. The second you start to push on that little bit and say, what do you mean by critical thinking? What do you mean by critical? All of a sudden, you realize we're not even talking about the same thing. In an academic sense, right, you might be thinking about critical thinking through the vantage of, I don't know, a doctoral dissertation defense, right, where, you know, it's about critiquing and tearing down an idea. Well, that's a form of critical thinking that's very valuable and has a certain application. When I talk to a lot of business leaders about critical thinking, I hear something very different. I hear original thinkers, creative thinkers. I hear problem solvers, right? These are different things. So I think we've rushed to agree that we all want critical thinking. I don't actually think we've had a thoughtful conversation. Guess why? Because there's hardly any forums where business leaders and school leaders are even talking to one another, let alone having a deep, meaningfully engaged conversation. So there's some interesting stuff. Now, here's another one. We're all worked up in America now about how we're doing on international standardized test comparisons across other countries. Now, we're not doing great, and we should focus on how we can improve. But let me just give you a little zinger here. There's 32 countries where there's overlapping measures between PISA scores on standardized tests and the global entrepreneurship measure, which is a measure of entrepreneurial activity in these countries. And it turns out it's a negative correlation. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and say that these things are mutually exclusive, but it's a really interesting thing to ask yourselves, careful what you wish for, right? If all we measure is how we're doing on PISA standardized test scores, and we don't pay attention to something as precious as entrepreneurial activity, I mean, you could argue that America is the world power that it is today just simply because of our entrepreneurial energy and grit. And I'll share with you a little bit more about why I'm particularly worried about this. But so should we worry as much as we are about PISA scores? Probably not. Do we need to improve them? Yes. But I don't know how worked up we need to be over it because there's a lot of other really important measures that I would actually put in front of how we're doing on some of these. Now, here's the crazy thing. What do we do in this country to evaluate who our best colleges and universities are? Well, there's a lot of ratings and rankings. Americans will make decisions on colleges. They'll open up magazines like U.S. News and World Report, and they'll say, this is the #1 or the whatever university. Here's the thing. We put a lot of weight in those rankings on inputs, and we call them outcomes. So there's a lot of weight given to these rankings based on the incoming SAT and ACT scores of students before they matriculate, their GPA in high school before they matriculate. Oh yeah, by the way, endowment size and a couple other things get factored in there. And then we put them into a machine and we say that's the #1 university. Here's the thing. No one has ever created a measurement of the learning growth of students from the time they matriculate to the time they graduate. We have no idea what the best college or university in this country is because we've never measured that. We have taken inputs, though, and churned them out as outcomes because we say, well, based on the selectivity of this institution, they're one of the best institutions in the country. No, that's not what that says. It just says they're the most selective. They deny more students than other institutions. That's all it says. So we use inputs as outcome measures, and the outputs we use as outcomes are also a little challenged. So again, don't misunderstand or hear something different coming out of my mouth. I'm not saying we get rid of these measures. What I'm saying is that they're necessary, but horribly insufficient. And so, and by the way, they're very narrow measures of success. So yes, I want to know about graduation rates. Yes, I want to know about grades, but here's a good one for you. The average GPA in higher education in the last 30 years has gone up 1.1 points. So if you graduated 30 years ago with a 2.3, I'm here to give you great news. That's really a 3.4, adjusted for today's GPA. And I know there's a few of you who are really excited right now. Who feels a lot better about their GPA right now? Go ahead, raise your hand. Thank you. Thank you for being brave. Here's the point. I don't know what a 3.4 means anymore. Actually, I do. It's average. But if you graduated 30 years ago, a 3.4 was spectacular. And by the way, there's evidence that grade inflation is actually more rampant in the most prestigious elite universities than all the others. So I don't know that GPA is the end-all be-all, right? So helpful thing to kind of put into the basket. But here's a real zinger for you. Hope is a much stronger predictor of college completion than SAT scores, ACT scores, or high school GPA. So you say, what's hope? Hope is one's ideas and energy for the future. It can be measured. Some of you are familiar with grit. That's become a very popular measure right now because of Angela Duckworth's work at Penn. These are what Gallup would call behavioral economic measures, right? You might call them, non-cognitive or social emotional measures. You can give different names to them, but here's the point. They're really important. They can be reliably measured. And the best news is that there's things that students and all of us helping them can do to improve these measures. They're highly malleable. So, for example, teachers, they're also contagious. Teachers who are hopeful teachers, what do? They spread hope to the kids in their classroom. And so it's a fascinating thing to think about. Hope is measured in 3 different ways. You have goals for the future. You see multiple pathways for accomplishing that goal. And then agency is the third leg of it, which is your belief in your ability to make it so. Usually when we measure hope, kids are not low on goals or agency. They're low on pathways. So if you say, my goal is to graduate college, and you say, great, how are you going to do that? And you say, I'm just going to work really hard. And you say, well, what if hard work alone doesn't get you there? And you're like, I don't know. I've never thought about that. That's an example of we need to help that student understand that he or she probably needs to make multiple plans and see multiple pathways for accomplishing goals. So it's really fascinating stuff to study and understand. So Gallup has been very interested in a really big, important question. What really is the ultimate outcome of an education? Is it just simply to get good grades and graduate? Well, like I said, flags on the way to a more important outcome. We've studied 2 things deeper, longer, further than any organization in the world that I think actually get at this, right? The degree to which you're engaged in the work that you do, and this is consistent across all job types, from manufacturing to high-paid jobs to low-paid jobs, everything in between, right? Blue-collar, white-collar, doesn't matter. These are fundamental measures of your emotional engagement in your work, and they matter a lot, and I'll tell you why. The other one is well-being, how people think about and experience their lives. And what we've learned about well-being in our U.S. research and our global research is that we've identified 5 really critical elements to a great life. And they're essentially, the way they're described up here, purpose, what we used to call career well-being, but it's defined by things like saying, I like what I do each day, or I have a chance to do what I'm best at every day. Social, financial, physical well-being pretty much sound like what they are. Social well-being, of course, though, is not the number of friends you have on Facebook, just to clarify. It's the depth and meaning of the relationships you have in your life. Community well-being is an interesting one because I think this is where we're going wrong in the values we espouse to millennials today is that here's the gold standard item on community well-being. See if any of you can hit the mark on this. You say, strongly agree to, in the last 12 months, I've been recognized for contributions made to my community. That's a tough one to hit. Only about 7% of Americans strongly agree to that. But if you do, it's the difference between what our researchers call a good life and a great life. Here's why I bring that up. I don't think you get to that place by being loosely affiliated with 17 extracurricular activities. I think you get to that place by being deeply, meaningfully committed to at least one of those. And so I worry when I see a resume of a young graduate that lists 17 different extracurricular activities. One of the first things I think about is that perhaps that came at the cost of being deeply, meaningfully engaged in any one of them. Now, we need to encourage students to explore. So I'm not saying we don't want to discourage that, but I think we need to do a better job of encouraging their long-term commitment to something. And I'll share some other findings around that. But here's the thing. Well-being sounds like a nice thing to measure, just like hope. It sounds nice, doesn't it? Oh, that's nice. And I can see a lot of the business leaders in the audience, they're totally tuned out right now. They're tweeting something else totally unrelated to what I'm saying because I'm talking about hope and well-being and all this soft, fluffy stuff. Not so much. The reason why we care about well-being is because it's one of the strongest predictors of critical key performance indicators that matter for our country and for all of our employers. So according to those 5 elements I just shared, if you're a person who's thriving in all 5, you have 1/3 of the healthcare cost burden to your employer compared to somebody who's not thriving in any. And you don't have to get employees thriving in all 5 elements. For every element you get somebody to a place of thriving, the healthcare cost burden just keeps going down. Why is this important? Because our healthcare tab in the U.S. right now is at $2.7 trillion. That's bigger than the entire GDP of Russia, to put it in perspective. So you could argue if anything's going to bankrupt our country, it's that, our healthcare tab. So it's important for schools to lower this. It's important for employers of all types to lower it. The point is, well-being is not a nice to have. This is a pretty hardcore necessity. And it's the same thing with our measures of employee engagement. When we think about workplace engagement, these are things that are about emotional engagement in your work. So you can see examples of them. You feel that you have someone who encourages your development. You have a chance to do what you're best at every day. Somebody cares about you, right? These are seemingly funny ones, and there's actually a great relationship between what we've learned about workplace engagement for adults of all ages, and interestingly enough, what we've learned about student engagement. And I'll share with you some of those commonalities. But here's why we care about workplace engagement is because those things I just shared are predictive of all these key performance indicators: productivity, absenteeism, turnover, if it's a business, even revenue and profit. So the reason why companies hire us to measure this, one of our great partners, by the way, Wells Fargo, we've been measuring workplace engagement for Wells Fargo. I know I met one of the folks from Wells Fargo today. They measure it because it matters to their bottom line. They care about employee engagement, but they also know smartly that it matters to their bottom line. So here's where I'm going to go with this. This is an interesting one. Only about 30% of Americans who show up for work every day are engaged in their work. That's it. There's about 100 million people who show up for work every day in the United States. 30 million are engaged. Now, the other 50 million are not terrible employees, right? They're not engaged in their work, but if you tell them to be there at 8, they'll show up right at 8. They clock out at 5, they're not at 5. They don't think about work after work or on the weekends, but they're not bad employees, okay? I don't want you to get the perspective that just because they're not engaged. But there's 20% of employees who are, this is a funny one, what our researchers call actively disengaged. What the heck does that mean? Has anybody seen the movie Office Space? You know what I'm talking about? So if you're actively disengaged, let's just say I'm actively disengaged and you've got a great idea, I will come and sit with you until that idea goes away. Okay? But by the way, we all know somebody like this. Maybe at one point in our career we were one of these people. They're so miserable, they don't just keep it to themselves, they try and spread it everywhere they go, right? So, but here's the important point I want to make, that if you have a manager who ignores you entirely, doesn't give you any feedback whatsoever, just ignores you, there's virtually no chance you're engaged in your job. Virtually no chance. Well, it's actually 2%. But if you have a manager who at least pays attention to you and spends all of his or her time focusing on constructive criticism, right, things you can do to improve, that is a huge boost over being ignored. You should feel really good. Because engagement jumps up to what, 45%. But as you'll note, there's still over 20% who are actively disengaged. But if you have a manager who focuses on what you're really good at and constantly tries to evolve your role to a place where you're able to do more of that more often, there's virtually no chance that you're actively disengaged. It's 1%. Now, I share with this data about our workplace because we have very similar findings when we study students in schools. So this is from our State of America's Schools report, free download on Gallup.com if you're interested. And at a very high level, here's what we know. That like PISA scores, we've got a lot of work to do on things like hope, engagement, and well-being. Only about a third of students in the U.S. are what we would call success ready by having high marks on each of these things. But here's where it gets a little interesting. Less than 50% of our students say they have a chance to do what they're best at each day in school. Less than half of them. But if they do, there's virtually no chance that they're actively disengaged. 87% who say they have a chance to do what they're best at each day are engaged in school, and only 1% of those are actively disengaged. So just like the workplace, just like what applies to you, your ability to show up every day and at some point in the day, not all day long, that's impractical, but at some point in the day to touch that moment where you say, that's the thing I do best, it's critical. Think of how long you'd stay in a job if you went weeks or months on end without ever touching that moment. Some people call it flow, right? Where you just, it doesn't feel like work because you love what you're doing, you're really good at it, just feels natural. So this is an important one to think about, is how are we helping students at least some point in their school day touch that moment? Because the measure is not all day long. That's not how we ask it, but at some point every day they touch that feeling where they're doing something that they're really good at or what they feel that they're best at. So this was one of the special findings from the study. This was a 30x finding. Students who strongly agreed to two simple things were 30 times as likely to be engaged in school. Their belief that their school builds on the strengths of each student. So this would be beyond just feeling that it happens for them, but also an awareness that it's happening for the other students in the building. And this is an inspiring one for any of you who are teachers or were teachers, that they had just one teacher who made them excited about the future. You want to ask me what the secret weapon is? There it is, right there. You say, okay, well, if we want to improve student engagement, what's the number one driver of student engagement? It's so simple. It's teacher engagement. And if you take that another step further, you say, okay, what's the number one predictor of teacher engagement? That's a really simple answer, too. It's a great principle at the building level. Some of you are principals in this room. Thank you. You have, I mean, maybe you do realize, but I'll just say it. You have no idea how important your job is. Easily the most important job in America. Even more so than teachers, because you're the ones who inspire and engage teachers. And if you do your job, that, inspiring and engaging teachers really well, student engagement just takes care of itself. So there's a lot of really hopeful news and some otherwise not so happy data that I'm sharing with you. Here's a good one. Almost half of the students in our schools say they plan to start their own business someday. So back to this entrepreneurial energy thing that America has been so great about. Almost half of our students say they plan to start their own business someday. Obviously, not all of them are going to go on to do that. But here's the real question. What are we doing to identify those kids who have entrepreneurial interests and talents and develop them? I would argue we're doing a better job identifying those kids as kids who might have attention deficit disorder than we are thinking about them as the next Mark Zuckerberg. And that's kind of a half joke, but it's also a half truth, because every time I say in an audience, there's a half, somebody chuckles and then people go, oh, he's right. What are we doing to identify that talent? There's all kinds of talents in this country. What are we doing to identify that talent? We do a pretty good job with athletes. We do a pretty good job with kids with high IQ, because right, if you take a test, we'll find you. You know, if you throw a football in 7th grade and there's a talent scout there, we know whether you have the talent to be an NFL quarterback or not, right there in 7th grade. Now, a whole bunch of other things might happen to you, but if I watch Vince Young throw a football in 7th grade, I can tell right then, if I'm a talent scout, whether he has a chance to be in the NFL. We can do the same thing with kids with great entrepreneurial talent. We can do the same thing with kids who are really great with their hands and building things and creating stuff, right? I just worry that our school system has set up a very narrow definition of talent and a very narrow definition of success. And we just keep beating ourselves over the head around that. So here's the answer on how we're doing capitalizing on this entrepreneurial energy pretty poorly. Less than 5% of students in our schools say they're currently interning with a local organization. If I had any advice for Idaho, in a state that could crush this, it's this: strong collaborations everywhere between local employers and schools. To think of it as an ethos, right? Whether there's policies and programs that encourage it or not, yes, those would be great things to do, but an ethos to say, we're going to be the state that makes the strongest connection between employers and schools in the form of internships for students. And oh, by the way, here's a crazy idea: externships for teachers. We may not be able to get internships for every single student in the state, although I would argue we could pull that off. But we could at least every 2 or 3 years put teachers in a situation where they're able to intensely work inside of a local organization, and they will figure out how they can bring back to the classroom and the school environment things that mimic more of the real world work experience. This is the most depressing data I have to share with you, so I promise it only goes up from here. You guys ready for this? I'm going to give a hopeful spin to it in a minute, but just stick with me for 1 second. Teachers of all professions in the United States, behind coal miners, truck drivers, and everybody else, are dead last in saying that their opinions at work count, and they're dead last in saying their supervisors create an open and trusting environment. Now, whatever we've done to get to a place where that's true about one of the most important professions in our country, shame on all of us. I mean, those are 2 of the most important measures of workplace engagement that I can come up. Now, but here's the thing. Don't make a mistake that it stinks to be a teacher. On workplace engagement, they have 2 noticeable black eyes, the ones I just mentioned. But here's a really fascinating one for you. You're going to go, Brandon, how could this be true? On well-being, different measure. On well-being, teachers are the second highest in overall well-being of all professions in the United States, second only to physicians. How could that be possible? Well, they love their lives. They love what they do. Here's an interesting one. Teachers and physicians are number 1 and number 2 in experiencing stress each day. They're the most stressful jobs in America. Physicians number 1, teachers number 2 in experiencing stress. They're also number 1 and number 2 in experiencing positive emotions each day. I smiled a lot, I laughed a lot, right? This is a high stress, high reward profession, just like being a physician. So don't make a mistake that it stinks to be a teacher. If we can improve the workplace engagement of teachers, specifically on these measures I mentioned about helping them feel their opinions at work count, and that they're in more of an open and trusting environment, you could argue it's the greatest profession to go into, because on every other metric that we measure, they look really great. By the way, we're going to need 2 million new teachers in the next 10 years because 2 of the 3 million teachers in the U.S. are going to retire. And I know this is probably a particular pain point for Idaho because I think you're already running a shortage of teachers, and it's only going to get worse. So you say, okay, how do we do that? Well, either the teacher ed colleges in the state are going to have to dramatically ramp up what's going on, or you're going to have to start recruiting teachers from other states that have a surplus of teachers. So if I were you, I might go looking at places like Michigan, states that I know have a surplus of teachers, and see if you can get some of them to move to Idaho. That'd be a pretty good idea. So let me transition a little bit about what we're learning works in school, and I'll just try and summarize some complex research. We did this big study of 21st century skills. We looked at a lot of things that define critical thinking, teamwork, collaboration, using technology to complete an assignment, long list of stuff. We found 2 things that sorted on their success as young Americans in the workplace. And it was these 2 things: whether they felt that they worked on a project that took more than a few classes to complete, so not just short-term assignments, but something that was actually a long-term project engagement, and that they applied it to solving a real problem. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But then you look at the percentages of either high school grads or college grads who hit the mark on those, and it's pretty darn low. Interestingly enough, on that second one, there's no difference between high school and college grads. They look about equivalent. In other words, colleges are not doing much better on applying what students are learning to solving a problem than high schools are. So there's a lot of other tidbits that I'll get to on that. But here's the good news. Demand for higher education is as high as it's ever been in this country. The thing we all have to keep remembering, though, is that most of us in this room probably have a college degree. The problem is that 60% of adults in America do not. So when we talk about the value of college, we have to remember that the vast majority of adults, and this is true in Idaho, I think it's 75% who don't have a college degree, and you're going to tell them college is important for their kid, and they're going to go, well, yeah, but I didn't get a college degree, and, you know, it worked out okay for me. Some, of course, know it didn't work out okay for them, but some feel that it did, right? So how do you increase students' belief in the value of higher ed if you're not also working on their parents' belief in the value of higher education? If not for them, if they feel like they've missed the opportunity for their kids. But here's what Americans are questioning. They're not questioning the value of higher education. They're questioning the quality of it. So we asked them to compare U.S. higher education to itself in the past or higher education institutions in other countries. Kind of mixed bag of results. But this is the important point. How are they measuring quality? If you missed this one, this is a big one. It's not to get a degree. No one's going to college anymore just to get a degree. Doesn't matter who you ask. College freshmen, as UCLA does in their famous SERP study, Gallup, as we do with a representative sample of Americans, right? Anybody we ask, why is college important? Number one reason, to get a good job. So if we've got a lot of graduates graduating and not getting good jobs, that's a pretty big failure because that's what they're going to college for. That's why they value college. What do business leaders want most when we survey them? They're a pretty simple answer. Real world work experience. They actually don't care as much about what the students majored in. They actually really don't care where they graduated from. That matters very little in their grand scheme of things. They want to know what they can do. What skills do they have, and do they have any relevant experience where they applied that? So we need to think about how we up our game on that across K-12 and especially in higher education. So let me wrap up with findings from the largest representative study of college graduates in U.S. history. This is a study of 30,000 college graduates, so this covers all age demographics, all types of institutions, and we were very interested primarily in whether they're engaged in their work and thriving in their well-being, these two measures that I've briefly described to you. We also asked household income and personal income and all kinds of stuff like that, but those are the two things we were most interested in. Here's the snapshot of findings. First of all, we found no difference whatsoever by type of institution that you graduated from. There was no difference in the likelihood that you're engaged in your job or thriving in your well-being, whether you went to a public university or a private one, whether you went to a highly selective one or not. And we even looked at the top 100 ranked schools in U.S. News and World Report against everybody else, and there was no difference. So don't misunderstand what I've said. There are individual colleges and universities that are outperforming others by miles on these measures. But it's not because they were public or private. It's not because they were selective or not. It's because of what they're doing or not doing that's contributing to these outcomes for their graduates. So typology doesn't matter, but what they do and how they do it matters a lot. So here's what we did learn. Ask yourselves these questions. These are good ones. So these are 5-point scales. 5 strongly agree, 1 strongly disagree. If you strongly agree to these 3 special questions, it doubled your odds of being engaged in your work over your lifetime, and you're 3 times as likely to be thriving in your well-being over your lifetime. These are very simply career and life trajectory game changers, and they're what we call emotional support items. So the first one is, I had at least one professor who made me excited about learning. How many strongly agree to that one? It's a good number. So probably about 80% in the room. The second one, the professors at, insert the name of your alma mater, the professors at my alma mater cared about me as a person. How many of you strongly agree to that? Man, you guys are doing good. How about the last one? I had a mentor who encouraged my goals and dreams. It's almost, that's crazy. It's almost half of this room. Let me tell you why that's crazy. You know what percent of American college graduates hit the mark on all 3 of these? So start with all 3. How many hit the mark on all 3? About a third of the room. 14% of college graduates nationally hit the mark on all 3. And on the mentor item, I mean, it was over 50% of this room. That one alone, only 22% of college graduates hit the mark on that one, which is to say that 8 out of 10 did not. It turns out it's the single most important thing we've seen linked to long-term career and life success. That one alone right there. If you said you had a mentor who encouraged your goals and dreams, that one alone doubles your odds of being engaged in work over your lifetime. We also found 3 special, what we call deep learning experiential items that were linked to workplace engagement. So these 3 also doubled your odds of being engaged in work, and they had a little relationship with well-being. So not quite as potent as the previous 3, but for workplace engagement, equally as important. And they were, this sounds similar to the other study I cited, whether you said you worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. How many strongly agree to that one? A little lower. That you had a job or an internship where you applied what you were learning in the classroom. How many hit the mark on that one? Ooh, that's solid. Well done. And then the last one, you were extremely involved in an extracurricular activity or organization. Now, those last 2 were sorting questions because we also asked, did you have a paid job in college, yes or no? And then we asked a long list of potential activities that you could have been involved in, fraternity, sorority, intramural, right, whole list of stuff. These were sorting questions. And it turns out they mattered a lot. So if you were just lightly involved in a whole bunch of things versus saying I was extremely involved in 1 or 2 of those, that's a game changer. Here's the problem. Only 6% of college graduates in the U.S. hit the mark on all 3 of these. And just break them down into their pieces. Take a long-term project. This one blows me away. Because I asked the question, what else are they doing? Just taking pop quizzes and writing 5-page papers all day? Right? I mean, seriously, think about it. So the percentage of college graduates, again, I'm not talking about dropouts here. I'm not talking about high school graduates. These are people who got the precious component of the American dream, this college degree. They met every academic requirement their institution set in front of them. Less than 1/3 of them said they worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. Less than 1/3. And only about 29% said they had a job or an internship where they applied what they were learning in the classroom. Here's the good news about these relatively bad scores. We can only go up from here. I mean, we can only go up from here. But then ask yourself an honest question, because I did this. At first, when I saw this data, I was like, gosh, how are we doing such a poor job? And then I got to thinking about these 6 things, and you say, well, honestly, why should we expect colleges to be doing any better on these measures? Because I can't come up with an institution that measures its people and its institution on how well they're doing on these metrics. I mean, I can think of examples, Northeastern and their famous co-op program. You know, almost every student who graduates there goes through a 6-month or 2 6-month co-op work experience. Okay, so but if we ask the honest question, why should we expect anything different? The answer is we shouldn't. Even the tenure process at most institutions of higher education is about what? What's the old expression? Publish or perish, right? Well, there's a value to tenure for that. But it's very different than recognizing and rewarding world-class classroom teaching or world-class mentoring or people who are just really good at helping students feel that they care about them. I mean, you can measure these things. You can also espouse them as a value, right? If you're a university president or a superintendent, I mean, the first thing you do is just say, we value this. The next best thing you do is actually measure it in some form because we found that these things matter a lot. So I showed you the breakdown on the percentage of this, so let me just wrap up and open it up for Q&A, but I think, you know, the point that I want to leave us with is we have so much room for improvement on these measures, and these things don't cost money. Some people will try and fight me on that, but I guarantee I'm ready for that debate, so if you want to go there, let's do it. They're not easy to do, okay? I'm not suggesting, oh, this is just so easy. But they don't cost money. You don't need to raise tens of millions of dollars in bond money to build a new building, right? These are things that can be done by changing what we value, changing what we believe in, and changing how we incentivize and reward and recognize people, the human beings in our system. So I look at all this data and I actually have a ton of hope. Because if leaders start to pay attention to these kinds of measures, they will figure out how to change it. I'll just leave you with this last example. We've measured a university whose graduates are 3 times higher than the national average on saying they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams. 68% of all their alumni strongly agree to that. And you'll never guess which university it is. We've measured, by the way, some pretty big names where they've hired us to measure their alumni against this national study. This one is Western Governors University. They're an adult-only online university. And if that's all you know about them, you sit there and scratch your head and go, how could they, of all institutions, be crushing it on this measure of mentoring? And the answer is really simple. I say this to every leader I talk to. If you just believe these things are happening, these 6 things I mentioned to you, if you just believe they're happening, guess again. Because as the percentages show you, if you just think that they're naturally occurring phenomenon, they're not. They're happening for a very few percentage of our graduates. Western Governors is killing it on this measure because they have intentionally invested in a model where they match every single student from the second they matriculate to the second they graduate with one person who serves as their advisor all the way through. And this is done on Google Hangout and Skype and phone and email, right? So most of them haven't even met each other in person. And by the way, the question wasn't, did you have an advisor who gave you good guidance on your course selection? That's not what we asked. A mentor who encouraged my goals and dreams, whatever it is. See, they've made an intentional investment in that model and just kind of blows everything out of the water in terms of our preconceived notions. Oh, you can't scale mentoring. How could I possibly do this? It's so expensive. You see what I'm saying? All of a sudden, you just say, if there's a will, there's a way. We can go make this happen. So I hope all of you will take this back in your own leadership here in Idaho and go make it happen, because there's every opportunity in the world to do that. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.